China buys a lot of cheap oil from Iran and relies on the Strait of Hormuz.
China views Iran as a partner in the alternative global order.
Why should China help sort out the US's mess? And that was just a massive narrative gift to Xi Jinping.
China has built a sufficient amount of strategic petroleum reserves that can last longer than 3 months.
The US-Israeli war in Iran is entering its second month.
But there's one country that's refused to get dragged into this conflict, at least so far, and that's China. It's the world's second largest economy, and it could be well positioned to not only weather this storm that we've seen for over a month now, but it could also benefit from the economic fallout.
China buys a lot of cheap oil from Iran and relies on the Straits of Hormuz, like a lot of countries here in Asia. It's got other interests in other areas of the Middle East that are being affected. It's got a lot of infrastructure projects. It's got its nationals working on the ground there. So on one hand, there's the aspect of Iran wanting to help Iran, wanting stability in the Middle East, and also what Zongyuan was pointing to, the fact that stability in general, both in terms of energy supply lines, but also in terms of global trade, is what China wants more than anything.
Okay, and I want to dig into that a bit more, Zoe. So it's been just over a month of war in this region at the moment, involving a massive oil exporter. China is a massive oil importer. So in that sense, in terms of the oil, how has this affected China?
So far, if we just look at the prices, gasoline price increase in China is so far has been around 10%, whereas here in the United States, on average, it increased at least 20%. So from that perspective, by pure numbers, China is relatively shielded. Part of the reason is because China has built a sufficient amount of strategic petroleum reserves that can last longer than 3 months. And then on the other hand, the Chinese energy mix has been quite diverse. The baseline energy mix include coal, and China domestically has a lot of coal. No coal comes from the Strait of Hormuz, and China can flexibly turn on or turn off its coal-fired power plant to meet the electricity demand. And then, of course, the other part of the energy mix in China is the story of the renewable or clean energy that a lot of us has already been familiar with. So overall, I'd say, yes, oil is important, but specifically to what extent China can withstand the oil shock, at least in the short run, I'd say China is very well prepared, but that doesn't mean China prefers volatility. That doesn't mean China wants a global oil shock. It doesn't.
And Rick, so how does this affect the relationship between the two leaders? Where does this latest conflict kind of put them in their interactions with each other? Because I know that Trump is expected to meet President Xi in May. And so what dialogue are they going to have along these lines? Because I imagine that both of them are going to want to have whatever's going on in Iran kind of wrapped up by then.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most interesting pieces, one of the narratives coming out of this was when Donald Trump asked for China's help to reopen the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, that was just a massive narrative gift to Xi Jinping, allowing him to paint himself as the stable partner, the leader of the new world order, and also, could position China in contrast to the US. And really, there's a lot of state media and commentators saying, why should China help sort out the US's mess? So there's obviously that angle to the Iran conflict, again, really helping China paint itself in that way. And the fact that Trump does have this mess, and that he only has to sort out what's going on in Iran, and he has to find a solution to getting the Strait of Hormuz reopened, does put him rather on the back foot coming into a meeting. They're set to meet in the middle of May, Xi and Trump. They've already had to delay that meeting because of the war in the Middle East. And so, of course, that's going to make it easier for Xi to push his own agenda. He's not going to want to talk that much about Iran. I should think he'll be what they had planned to talk about before, most importantly, trade, making sure that trade truce continues, the tariffs stay low, that there can be less restrictions on export controls, that sort of thing. And also, what China sees as its core interests, things like issues like Taiwan.
Zoe, I just want to talk about the present state with the relationship between China and Iran. Does China see Iran as a partner or a problem?
I'd say it's both. It depends upon the circumstances, right? China views Iran as a partner, as a very important pillar in in the alternative global order that China is leading and China has been pushing to construct. And a lot of this has to do with the reducing the vulnerabilities to U.S. sanctions, especially financial sanctions. And Iran is a partner to process the transaction of energy, especially oil and other imports from China using renminbi. And then on the other hand, Iran is also a very vocal partner in terms of anti-West, especially anti-America. And then on the other hand, Iran is also a strategic liability in this particular context, because to see from a pure materialistic point of view, the Iranians' attack in the region also devastate a Chinese investment in the area. And on top of that, the escalation of the regional war risk dragging the global economy into a recession, and that is going to dampen global demand. That is going to be a terrible news for Chinese export-oriented economy. So overall, I'd say yes, China sees Iran as a important partner in achieving self-reliance, but self-reliance for China is not autarky. China simply wants a higher degree of freedom to operate in a global order that China has a veto power in.
Zoe, what does China get from its relationship with Iran that it can't easily get somewhere else, or other countries, including Chinese neighbors that produce oil, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say, if we really, I'd say we really need to be specific about when we say China, what do we really mean, right? I think China, there is one thing that China can, like Chinese, the party can get from Iran, but less so from other area, which is the testing of using renminbi and scaling up of renminbi-based financial infrastructure. Iran is very important, a global trading part, a global oil producer, and a natural gas reserve. And then on top of that, as a anti-Western or new global order, Iran is also a vocal point. It has a long-running history of anti-America. And then on top of that, I do not see anything else that Iran could offer that China cannot get from. For example, Iran has oil, and people can make the argument saying that Iranian oil has been heavily discounted, but the Venezuelan oil has also been heavily discounted, even cheaper than the Iranian oil. And then on top of that, before the war, we were literally talking about a global oil supply glut, meaning there was sanctioned Russian oil, there was sanctioned Iranian oil, sanctioned Venezuela, sanctioned oil from all over the place. A lot of these were benefiting the small teapot refineries in China, specifically in Shandong province. The big state-owned oil and gas companies in China, they do not want to touch those.
But Zoe, at the same time, aren't we worried that because of this price shock that comes out of oil going up, which affects prices for all kinds of products from food to plastics and clothing, everything, fertilizer, absolutely everything. Yes. Doesn't that mean that there's going to be a struggle with the purchasing power of China's most important export partners, so they will be able to buy less products from China, and then that would have a negative impact on China? So are we seeing the positive because of the potential in renewable energy sales of solar panels and things like that? Or are we going to see a net negative because the people who would normally be buying from China aren't able to?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think this is also the policy dilemma that the Chinese policymaker tries to figure out. Part of the reason is also because China now is right at the beginning of the 15th five-year plan, and the entire 15th five-years plan scream one word, which is self-sufficiency, right? And that basically means China needs stability in the global system, and it also wanted to continue to focus on manufacturing capacity. That basically means that China is going to continue to rely on export, count on global demand. But any major shock in the global market is going to, and increase the price increase in fertilizers in particular is going to create a lot of a panic buying, for example, and drive up concerns for food security, especially among emerging market economies. And since the conflict happened, we've already seen coffee prices, grain prices, and other major commodities prices have all gone up. This could also put a lot of pressure on the Chinese government with regards to the Chinese renminbi. They've been talking a lot about the purchasing power or the exchange rate of the renminbi. And if this is the moment that China decided to slightly appreciate the renminbi, that is helpful to curb the trade surplus, China's trade surplus with the rest of the world, but is also going to make Chinese export less affordable for other countries. So it's a dilemma. It really depends upon how long the war lasts. And if this is a war that President Trump could start, but it cannot end it, then we could potentially see the war drag for a longer time.
And Rick, we've seen this, just to go into a bit more of what Zoe was saying, this change to kind of diversify export partners, more self-sufficiency by trying to stimulate domestic demand as well. How successful has this been for China so far, in your view?
Yeah, well, China got quite a shock during the tariff war around this time last year. And since then, it's taken quite a lot of measures. And exports over 2025 were actually up for China. It managed to sort of diversify away from the US, but the markets that it was selling its stuff to is now more in the global south. So Southeast Asia, Latin America. So with those markets, they're less likely to buy the high valued, the expensive products that they were exporting to the US and Europe. And of course, with this big oil shock, those markets, particularly Southeast Asia, are the ones that are getting hit hardest and quickest by that huge increase in price in oil. We've seen really some quite big measures in Southeast Asia. Pumps going dry, 4-day working weeks, all this sort of thing. So obviously, back to the same kind of big rule that if it's not stable out there, China can't export its goods that it needs to keep the economy going.
Rick, China recently used rare earth minerals as a pressure point against the U.S. last year when we were talking about the U.S. trade/tariff war with China. I'm wondering, if we look into our crystal balls, of course, that we all have, into 10 years or so, is China going to have developed other pressure points to help keep it in a power position, especially when it comes to the United States? Or in 10 years, is China still going to be as exposed to something like fossil fuels as it is in this, I was going to say this Gulf War, but the current situation in the Gulf?
I think if the last few years tell us anything, it's that, China is the big planner here. There is the 5 years plan, the 15-year plans, and even what we've been talking about today and what we've seen since the crisis in the Middle East, since the war on Iran, is that China has diversified more than in any other country in the region. That it has been able to weather this storm better than most places. I think that's one lesson we've learned, and the other is that yes, the geopolitics and the economy, the global economy, trade, materials that need to cross borders are all becoming much closer links. So, this started with a war, but it's the energy shock that is creating the biggest destabilization. and we've seen that China is very good at using different elements of trade and commerce, political and also military, all together to push its interests. And we saw that when it was debating with the US and its chokehold that it has on those rare earth minerals. And we've seen what happens in the global economy when one resource is choked, just how fragile the global economy is. So this time it's oil. Last year it was rare earth minerals. During the pandemic, it was, other things like chips not being able to get around. So I think if we were to look into our crystal balls, we can just look back in the last few years that this is the way the world works now. The moving around the world of these critical, whether it's commodities or materials, technologies, are being weaponized to a certain extent. And I would see that that's going to carry on and could be happening more and more.
Hey YouTube, you've been watching a sneak preview of our podcast, The Dip, where we cover money stories that cross borders.
And if you want more, you can check out where to subscribe in the description, because we have a link right there, or you can scan this QR code that's appearing on your screen right now.
See ya.